2 a.m. A woman woke up to the sound of glass breaking. A flashlight was shining directly on her face, and a cold male voice whispered, "Move, you die." This was not a Hollywood movie, no Tom Cruise jumping in to save her, but a real nightmare from the Golden State Killer, the man who turned peaceful homes into hell in his bedroom. And believe me, you will not sleep well after hearing this story. The sound of glass breaking echoed in the middle of the night, a sharp sound that tore through the quiet atmosphere of the suburban house. The woman lying on the bed woke up, her heart pounding, trying to convince herself that it was just a dream. But only a few seconds later, the cold white light from a flashlight shone directly on her face, making her stiffen. In the darkness behind the beam of light, a short, muscular figure, his face covered by a ski mask, stood silent like a ghost. His voice rang out, deep and cold, "Don't move, or you die." She wanted to scream, but her throat was choked, as if being squeezed by an invisible hand. All she could hear was her own breathing, mixed with the slow, steady footsteps of him approaching the bed. He was carrying a rope, and a feeling of terror filled her entire body, every hair standing on end. He was in no hurry. Each movement seemed calculated and practiced countless times. She felt his breath right next to her ear, reeking of tobacco and sweat, before he pinned her wrists to the mattress and tied them up in seconds. The rope was so tight that her wrists hurt, and she cried out in despair. In the next room, hurried footsteps echoed. Her husband, just waking up from a noise, stepped out into the hallway. But he was prepared. Another dark figure rushed in, also wearing a mask, or maybe it was just him, but moving so fast it seemed like there were two of them. The man had a knife pressed directly to his neck, forced to lie face down on the floor. His voice hissed, commanding, "Lie still, face down. If you look at me, I will kill your wife." The house suddenly turned into a battlefield where the couple became hostages of a mad stranger. No neighbors heard. No one came to save, only the sound of ropes, the sound of knives scraping the floor, and muffled crying. She was dragged out of bed, thrown onto the cold floor. He grabbed a towel, covered her eyes. Everything turned into absolute darkness. Only the feeling of her body being invaded, forced to obey. In her head, a series of questions swirled. Why did he choose our house? What does he want? Will he kill us? But the answer came very quickly when his rough hands began to drag her across the floor, pushing her into a corner of the room. He shouted at her husband, "Don't move. If you move, I will slit her throat." The husband lay motionless, his whole body trembling, gritting his teeth in endurance, his eyes wide open in the darkness, seeing his wife tied up, threatened right before his eyes, but completely helpless. Those moments seemed to last forever. He gave orders while rummaging through the house, the sound of drawers opening, the sound of cabinets being rummaged through, the sound of objects falling. He did not just come to rob. The way he moved, the way he controlled every detail showed that his main purpose was to sow fear. Every time he approached, she felt the whole room shrinking, as if suffocating in a nightmare from which she could not wake up. Then, as if by a ritual, he turned back to her, whispering in her ear in a creepy voice, "I have been watching you for a long time. Do you think I don't know everything about you?" The words left her speechless. From that moment, safety, privacy, everything she believed in about normal life in the suburbs suddenly disappeared. After subduing both husband and wife, he began what police later determined was a familiar Golden State Killer motif. The husband was tied up, immobilized, a stack of plates placed on his back. "If I hear one drop, your wife is dead." This psychological trap made him a prisoner in his own body, his every breath a precaution, while he turned to mentally torturing his wife. In the darkness, the sound of knives scraping against ropes, the sound of clothes being ripped, the victims sobbing for mercy. No one could save them. The scene was repeated in dozens of other families across California. People living in quiet, seemingly safe suburbs suddenly became targets. At first, small burglaries, then nighttime break-ins, rapes, and finally brutal murders. The name East Area Rapist and later Golden State Killer became an obsession that lasted for decades. But that night, for the unfortunate couple, Everything was just the beginning of a nightmare with no way out. The husband's plate on his back trembled and rattled, but he tried to stay calm, holding his breath. Meanwhile, the wife felt every movement of the stranger. The flashlight beam swept through the dark room and stopped right on the tear-stained face. He knelt down. I stood outside the window many nights. I watched you cook, watched you talk on the phone, watched you sleep. The confessions turned the room into an invisible iron cage, a private place that had long been invaded without anyone knowing. Rough hands pressed tightly, bodies trembled in vain resistance, and terror spread like wildfire. He moved around the house for hours. The sound of drawers being pulled, bottles being broken, knives being scraped on the table, all of it forming the haunting soundtrack of the night of terror. The wife was still tied up and blindfolded, her ears strained to listen to every sound, each sound like a knife cutting into her heart. She heard him eating in the kitchen, opening the refrigerator, chewing loudly, then laughing madly. He did not rush to leave, but enjoyed the feeling of possession, prolonging the psychological torture. The husband lay still, his back tensed, holding the stack of plates on his body, sweat dripping down. He knew that if he made a small mistake, his wife would die instantly. The seemingly endless moment ended when he left, but he did not, leaving the silence behind. Before disappearing, he whispered a sentence that made both of them freeze. "I will be back." The back door closed. Darkness engulfed the house, leaving only the two victims trembling, tied up, and the memory of the horror that had just occurred. By the time neighbors heard the noise and the police arrived, it was too late. He had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a house in disarray and two broken hearts. The nighttime break-ins repeated like a nightmare throughout Sacramento and the surrounding suburbs. Each story was eerily similar. The sound of glass breaking or a sliding door opening, the bright flash of a flashlight, a hoarse male voice giving orders, the rope tied tightly, and the husband placed immobile with a plate on his back. He became a predator who knew his prey's every habit. Victims reported feeling as if they had been watched for days. Windows opening, strange dog barks, shadows in the yard. Only when the case was over did they realize that every sign had foretold the night of terror. He had robbed them not only of safety, but also of the idea of home. Families who were victims described permanent changes. They moved, installed new locks, slept with the lights on. Children were scared for years. Suburban homes that had once symbolized peace became battlefields where the slightest noise startled people. Another victim said that while she was tied up, she heard him whispering an incomprehensible phrase over and over again, as if he were lost in his own world. She couldn't see clearly, but she sensed the flickering lights, the slow footsteps moving through the hallways. He didn't kill right away, didn't leave quickly, but enjoyed absolute control. After several hours, he disappeared, leaving the woman collapsed in the darkness and her husband motionless nearby, his eyes wide with fear. In the late 1970s, Sacramento police received a series of similar reports, but the clues were vague. He left no trace other than neatly cut ropes and strange shoe prints. Victims described him as tall, about 1m75, solid build, hoarse voice. But every time the police filed a case, he changed the details, sometimes wearing a ski mask, sometimes wrapping a scarf around his head, sometimes just wearing a woolen hat. He was as unpredictable as a ghost. What scared the community the most was the way he played with fear. Once, after controlling a family, he sat in the kitchen eating oranges, laughing as he ate. Another time, he turned on the TV, turned the volume down low, and sat watching while the victim was tied up in the living room. That feeling of helplessness tormented people for years afterward. One woman said she could never forget the smell of his sweat, like a permanent mark that stuck to her memory. The number of attacks gradually increased, from a few sporadic cases to dozens in a row. The press nicknamed him the East Area Rapist. Housewives lived in fear. Men with guns waited in the living room. Children cried out every time the power went out. The police set up a specialized team, organized a response attack, but he always seemed to be one step ahead. Another night, a young newlywed couple fell victim. The bride had just fallen asleep when she was startled by a bright light, and the familiar scene repeated itself. Ropes, blindfold, plate on the husband's back. But this time, he stayed longer, rummaging through every drawer, taking small, worthless items like rings, bracelets, souvenir photos. For him, it was not a material trophy, but a way to sew more psychological wounds. When he disappeared, the room still smelled of sweat, and the wife's eyes were wide open in the darkness, not daring to believe it was real. The story spread quickly throughout California, spreading collective fear. People began calling him by different nicknames, but for each victim, he was not anonymous. He was the face covered in the night, the voice hissing in the ear, the recurring nightmare. The first chapter of this tragedy closed with the morning the next burglary appeared on the local news. People in the neighborhood sat frozen with half-hot cups of coffee, because every detail was hauntingly familiar. A window being forced open at night, faint footsteps on the porch, a flashlight beam sweeping across a bedroom, and a cold whisper, "Don't move." The first of what police call the East Area Rapist was remembered not just for its brutality, but also for the consistency of its pattern. The victim was tied up, the husband or partner was immobilized, and the perpetrator sought to instill fear more than gain. In one case in Rancho Cordova, Linda recalled waking up to rough hands on her and whispers that he had been watching her for several nights. She still remembered the smell of cigarettes, sweat, and the feeling of being watched from outside the window in the weeks before, a series of small clues that they hadn't connected at the time. Later that night, Linda woke up feeling as if the house was no longer a sanctuary. Every small sound, from a cabinet door rattling to a dog barking outside, startled her. In another case, the Martinez's home was invaded one summer night. Their son heard the sound of glass breaking and ran out to see a figure gliding into the darkness. The intruder moved purposefully, not rummaging for money, but seeking human presence to manipulate their minds. Mrs. Martinez said the perpetrator treated her as if he wanted to assert his power. He tied her hands behind her back, gagged her, and whispered meaningless words as if it were a ritual. No one in the family felt they had lost anything of great value, but they had lost something else, their faith in fences, in locks, in the safe words of suburban life. A few weeks later, they installed motion sensor lights, bought guard dogs, and still spent many nights awake, listening for every small sound in panic. The young couple in Citrus Heights shared their story in an interview with reporters, their voices shaking as they recounted it. Her husband said he was forced to lie face down on the floor, a stack of plates placed on his back like an invisible hostage. If the plate falls, she's dead. The tension was justified by a game of reality, a psychological trick that kept the husband from moving even as hours passed. The wife was violated, but she avoided details. The words attacked hung in the air, enough for everyone to understand what had happened. They moved later, but the psychological earthquake was still there. The wife told of waking up in the middle of the night, her heart pounding, thinking the footsteps had returned. The incidents were not limited to one area. He moved like a ghost through the districts, choosing targets with similar characteristics. Houses deep in residential areas, windows facing backyards with little traffic, residents confident that the speed and safety of suburbia would protect them. What was haunting was that the perpetrator seemed to know a routine: when to leave, when children were asleep, when neighbors locked their doors for the night. One woman reported that a few days before the break-in, she had found strange footprints on her backyard lawn in the morning. When she spoke to the police, they noted them but could not yet link them to the perpetrator, at least not with DNA or physical evidence. As the number of cases increased, the community began to view each other with suspicion. Everyone wondered if someone was watching them, someone who knew their every move. The police initially deployed traditional measures: night patrols, ambushes, asking residents to report anything suspicious. They took statements, drew crime scene diagrams, and tried to find commonalities. One detective said that what made this case so difficult to crack was that the perpetrator left no obvious evidence. He wiped where he touched things, left no clothes, left no discernible fingerprints on objects he handled, and sometimes covered his victims' eyes to avoid being identified. But there was one thing he always left: a deep sense of violation, a reminder that I can come back. Police began to compare descriptions of voice, posture, restraint techniques, and other small details. Gradually, they recognized a recurring pattern. This was not a robber in a hurry, but one who was calculating, meticulous, and took pleasure in controlling his prey. Victims said he did not act like a reckless bully. His actions were intentional. There was a routine. He looked for evidence of a breach, taking small items to prove his control, or simply rummaging through them as if to prolong his fear. Some thought he returned to old locations to relish the sense of crisis. It was these small details that later helped investigators piece together cases, even though they initially seemed disjointed and meaningless. The lab recorded a few inconclusive fibers and hairs, and DNA analysis was not as it is today. It was an era before technology could turn small fragments into incriminating evidence. While the victims were overwhelmed with fear, the press began to prey on him and gave him evocative nicknames. East Area Rapist, later added to the Golden State Killer in many places as clues to the murder emerged. Radio commentators used dramatic language, making the community both curious and fearful. The story was exaggerated, increasing the level of panic. Some commented that the media somehow enhanced the brand of the criminal. Each nickname was like a talisman, making him appear more powerful in the eyes of the public. Victims felt exploited, inserted into a sensational story where they had to recount their loss and mental torture over and over again, sometimes with details they did not want to mention. Another example is the Jensen family, where the eldest son approached the stranger while he was rummaging through a cupboard, but could not clearly identify him because his face was covered. The stranger made threats and left, leaving a lingering gloom. The family's mother reported that she no longer dared to let her daughter out at night, that family dinners were filled with silence and fear. These small behavioral changes added up to a major trauma. People reduced socializing, avoided uncurtained windows, installed cameras, and lived in a state of constant vigilance. Children were most affected. Those who once ran outside were now called indoors earlier, a younger generation growing up with the sense that the outside world could be dangerous even in their own neighborhood. Police tried to hold community meetings, share tips like multiple locks, keeping outdoor lights on, and creating a network of neighbors to watch out for each other. But the deep nature of this crime could not be prevented by technical advice. Every night, as darkness fell, some part of the residents' imagination wondered if someone was lurking in the shadows, if they would return to the address where they had attacked. Many began installing barriers in their windows, installing rear-view mirrors, trying all. As more cases occurred, the pressure on investigators grew. They sorted through files, compared descriptions, compared stolen items, searched for clues in the smallest nooks and crannies. Fingernail prints on walls, dirt on the steps, scraps of paper left behind. A major criminal case was being built, but without today's technology, the work felt like assembling a puzzle with many missing pieces. Detectives occasionally had small glimpses of hope, a witness identifying a voice in one case, a new footprint at another, but those hopes were often short-lived. What was worse was that the victim's pain was wrapped up in statements, stored in files. Their lives continued to be disrupted, many suffering from long-term trauma, needing to see therapists, or living with insomnia and panic. As the summer wore on and the leaves fell, the attacker remained at large. The incidents shifted from nighttime break-ins to more serious ones, and the resulting homicides added to the police problem. But during this period, what most frightened the community was not the number of incidents, but the fact that the man was still at large, a man who had evaded all initial countermeasures, a man who could break into your home without explanation. The stories of each individual, each family, formed a mass of shared pain, and that was what investigators were beginning to understand. To catch him, they needed more than patrols. They needed to connect with victims, listen to seemingly small details, and patiently turn the scraps into evidence. The initial intrusions were like small needles pricking the flesh of the community, But within a few years, those needles turned into deep cuts. The escalation was not random, but systematic, gradually chipping away at the last layer of safety that people had once trusted. When the name of what the press would later call the East Area Rapist began to appear, accompanied by cases of severe harm or murder, it changed the nature of the hunt completely. From nights of binding, forcing, and abandoning, he moved to more brutal behavior, causing severe physical harm to survivors and leaving behind bodies as evidence, sinking into a fear that no one could fill. Those who had told were only fragments of what had once been normal. Family laughter turned to sighs, children's eyes became wary, and community meetings now always began with the question, "When was the last time you felt safe?" One early spring morning, when the sun was still low, people discovered a body in a dirt road on the edge of the forest, a case that shook the entire city. The victim was a young woman, not famous or wealthy. She was just part of everyday life, with a job, friends. Investigators described the scene as chaotic, but with signs of a bond. The wounds showed a struggle. Perhaps the victim had tried to fight back. News spread like wildfire. The press called it a new crime by a man previously known only for break-ins. Suddenly, from a person who only damaged the psyche, he became a direct threat to life. Families began to look at each other with a different kind of horror, not just being broken into, but possibly losing their lives. Victims who were lucky enough to survive said that the perpetrator began to show that he was not just psychologically torturing. He was more thorough in his violent acts. A middle-aged woman recalled waking up one night with a stranger in her room, feeling suffocated by the air. She found him more aggressive, moving quickly and decisively, seemingly ready for any reaction from the victim. When she tried to plead, he simply laughed unnaturally and left after threatening, "Don't tell anyone, or I'll be back." This was no longer a simple form of psychological terror. It was a direct threat, implying the possibility of worse violence if anyone dared to intervene. Many survivors said that when the perpetrator assaulted, he sometimes showed uncontrolled anger, as if he had gone beyond the point of just controlling for the sake of fear. Now, he craved coercion and destruction. The press and the public have increased attention, but that attention has not always paid off. Instead, it has a downside. The perpetrator seems to enjoy that small fame, and sometimes, according to one victim, he talks about himself as someone who can do things the community can't imagine. Investigators have found that when a criminal feels he can hide by moving his area of operation, he takes more risks. He learns from previous cases, changes his tactics, tries to avoid the mistakes that once caused him to be exposed. That makes the hunt for him tense. The criminal becomes smarter, more dangerous, and extremely determined. The murders have not only changed the way police work, but also the voices of victims. Previously, many felt ashamed, secretive. They feared being stigmatized, considered troublemakers. But when their lives became targets, survivors began to bravely speak up, sharing more details so that police could piece together the puzzle. One woman said in an interview that she could no longer remain silent after learning that someone had died in a similar way. Silence could mean more lives were taken. The stories, when connected, formed a clearer chain. Descriptions of the voice, the height of the body, the way the husband was penetrated, personal details like how he tied the rope or placed objects on the husband's back. These seemingly small details later became key to tracing. The psychological toll on survivors was immeasurable. Many fell into depression, obsession, lost the ability to work. Some never returned to the old house they called home after the attack. Some withdrew from relationships, believing they had been marked. Psychologists in the community began to have busier work than ever. Therapy, support, legal aid. The haunting was not just the memory of a single night. It's the feeling of being on the defensive, a twisted survival reflex. Parents overprotect their children, spouses lose trust, neighbors start to distrust each other. The social consequences spread like ripples on a lake. The police set up a dedicated line, collected files, analyzed patterns. They spent hours listening to tapes of statements, comparing every detail. One detective recalled creating a file of voice descriptions, The initial intrusions were like small needles pricking the flesh of the community, but within a few years those needles turned into deep cuts. The escalation was not random, but systematic, gradually chipping away at the last layer of safety that people had once trusted. When the name of what the press would later call the East Area Rapist began to appear, accompanied by cases of severe harm or murder, it changed the nature of the hunt completely. From nights of binding, forcing, and abandoning, he moved to more brutal behavior, causing severe physical harm to survivors and leaving behind bodies as evidence, sinking into a fear that no one could fill. Those who had told were only fragments of what had once been normal. Family laughter turned to sighs, children's eyes became wary, and community meetings now always began with the question, "When was the last time you felt safe?" One early spring morning, when the sun was still low, people discovered a body in a dirt road on the edge of the forest, a case that shook the entire city. The victim was a young woman, not famous or wealthy. She was just part of everyday life, with a job, friends. Investigators described the scene as chaotic, but with signs of a bond. The wounds showed a struggle. Perhaps the victim had tried to fight back. News spread like wildfire. The press called it a new crime by a man previously known only for break-ins. Suddenly, from a person who only damaged the psyche, he became a direct threat to life. Families began to look at each other with a different kind of horror, not just being broken into, but possibly losing their lives. Victims who were lucky enough to survive said that the perpetrator began to show that he was not just psychologically torturing. He was more thorough in his violent acts. A middle-aged woman recalled waking up one night with a stranger in her room, feeling suffocated by the air. She found him more aggressive, moving quickly and decisively, seemingly ready for any reaction from the victim. When she tried to plead, he simply laughed unnaturally and left after threatening, "Don't tell anyone, or I'll be back." This was no longer a simple form of psychological terror. It was a direct threat, implying the possibility of worse violence if anyone dared to intervene. Many survivors said that when the perpetrator assaulted, he sometimes showed uncontrolled anger, as if he had gone beyond the point of just controlling for the sake of fear. Now, he craved coercion and destruction. The press and the public have increased attention, but that attention has not always paid off. Instead, it has a downside. The perpetrator seems to enjoy that small fame, and sometimes, according to one victim, he talks about himself as someone who can do things the community can't imagine. Investigators have found that when a criminal feels he can hide by moving his area of operation, he takes more risks. He learns from previous cases, changes his tactics, tries to avoid the mistakes that once caused him to be exposed. That makes the hunt for him tense. The criminal becomes smarter, more dangerous, and extremely determined. The murders have not only changed the way police work, but also the voices of victims. Previously, many felt ashamed, secretive. They feared being stigmatized, considered troublemakers. But when their lives became targets, survivors began to bravely speak up, sharing more details so that police could piece together the puzzle. One woman said in an interview that she could no longer remain silent after learning that someone had died in a similar way. Silence could mean more lives were taken. The stories, when connected, formed a clearer chain. Descriptions of the voice, the height of the body, the way the husband was penetrated, personal details like how he tied the rope or placed objects on the husband's back. These seemingly small details later became key to tracing. The psychological toll on survivors was immeasurable. Many fell into depression, obsession, lost the ability to work. Some never returned to the old house they called home after the attack. Some withdrew from relationships, believing they had been marked. Psychologists in the community began to have busier work than ever. Therapy, support, legal aid. The haunting was not just the memory of a single night. It's the feeling of being on the defensive, a twisted survival reflex. Parents overprotect their children. Spouses lose trust. Neighbors start to distrust each other. The social consequences spread like ripples on a lake. The police set up a dedicated line, collected files, analyzed patterns. They spent hours listening to tapes of statements, comparing every detail. One detective recalled creating a file of voice descriptions, someone described. As the number of attacks increased, the pressure on the police exploded. Sacramento police created task forces, built maps with pins to show the locations of break-ins, and marked each rape and murder with red dots, making the map look like a battlefield. With each new family reporting, another red dot appeared, and gradually the once-pegged suburb began to look like a war zone. At community meetings, people lined up and asked officers, "When are you going to catch him? How long do we have to live like this?" But the answers were often just promises and commitments, because the concrete evidence was scarce and the criminals were so adept at concealment. Detectives scrutinized every little detail day and night. They analyzed shoe prints on the ground, measured the size of the soles, and compared them to common military, running, and work shoes. They examined the ropes used to bind the victims, finding some that came from the kind sold only in military stores. The theory was that the perpetrator might have been a police officer, a soldier, or at least someone who had undergone rigorous training. This theory was further supported by the comments of many witnesses that he moved with extreme discipline, worked quickly, and had a clear understanding of policing tactics. But potential suspects were numerous. The list ran into the hundreds and was gradually eliminated for lack of direct evidence. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the police tried many tactics. They set traps, set up officers disguised as women, and set up nighttime ambushes in areas where he was likely to return. But he always seemed to know. Many times, just as the police withdrew, a new incident would occur somewhere else, just a few blocks away. It felt as if he was following the police, moving in the opposite direction to avoid them. One veteran detective recalled that they had been on a 72-hour ambush, barely sleeping, without finding a trace. Then, just a night later, a few miles away, there was a new case. The investigators' spirits were worn down. The tension was palpable. When the first murders were linked to the East Area rapist motif, the horror reached a new level. It was no longer just a night of burglary, but now a bloody death. Charlene and Lyman Smith were murdered in their own Ventura home. The evidence at the scene showed the perpetrator had followed the same ritual: bound, blindfolded, restrained by placing objects on the husband, then killed. For the police, the similarity was the key to the connection, but for the community, it was a death sentence hanging over their heads. Front-page articles, blurry crime scene photos, italicized witness statements like screams for help. The more cases, the more questions. Some believe the perpetrator must have been a local resident, perhaps a seemingly benign neighbor. One woman once said that the day after the break-in, a man on the next street asked with a strange look in his eyes, as if he knew what had happened. Police checked neighborhood records, checked people who had served in the military, people who had been disciplined for working in the police force. But there was no concrete evidence enough to make an arrest. Suspicion reigned, making the whole community suspicious of each other. People began calling the police whenever they saw someone wandering around at night, or when they saw a flashlight in the yard. The number of reports skyrocketed, but the number of cases solved was almost zero. In those days, DNA analysis technology was not yet developed. Police stored semen samples, hair, and fabric fibers, but they could only store them in evidence. They knew these were important pieces, but they had to wait until some future scientific advancement to decipher them. That was one of the factors that made the case drag on for decades, from the era of pen and paper to the era of computers, from typewriters to modern genetic analyzers. But in the 1980s, with limited tools, all they had were thick files and hundreds of statements. The more they investigated, the more leads led to dead ends. Sometimes they caught a suspect with matching shoe sizes, but tests ruled him out. Sometimes they suspected a police officer disciplined for domestic violence, but he had an alibi. The interrogations went on hundreds of times, hundreds of hours, but the results were only more exhausting. One detective said the case was like chasing a ghost, thinking they had a hold of him. He would disappear into the night. The victims lived in constant haunting. Families who were attacked years later still slept with the lights on, with their windows covered, and kept their dogs indoors. Some left California altogether, hoping to forget. But the memories did not go away. In later interviews, many women said they never got over the feeling of being followed, even after the perpetrator had long since disappeared. They still felt eyes in the dark, breathing on the back of their necks. The incompetence of the police also became wounds in the community. People began to doubt their protectors. They said, if the police can't catch us, what are we going to do? Some formed vigilante groups, patrolled together, bought guns, and learned to triple lock their doors. But even so, the break-ins continued. He seemed to know how to pick his targets, avoiding families who were armed or overly cautious. He chose houses that seemed safe but had a small loophole, an unlatched window, an unlocked back gate, or a low, easy-to-climb fence. With one slip, he turned it into a nightmare. As time passed, the case grew cold. The press moved on. The community began to regard it as a dark but unsolvable part. Many detectives moved on, retired, or gave up. Files piled up, gathering dust in the archives. The initial fear remained, but was replaced by weariness and resignation. We never knew who he was, only that he existed. One victim's words summed up the sense of helplessness felt by a generation. But in the darkness of despair, the pieces of evidence remained in boxes. DNA samples, ropes, crime scene photographs, all waiting for science to advance. Meanwhile, the perpetrator disappeared, living as just another person among millions of Californians, unrecognized. The hunt seemed to end in a stalemate, leaving dozens of victims, dozens of broken families, and a wound in the collective memory that would never heal. Decades passed, and the dusty boxes of evidence in the archives remained untouched. The old detectives retired, new recruits learned about the case only from books, and the community thought the perpetrator had disappeared forever. But scientific advances opened new doors. In the late 1990s, DNA technology began to develop, and forgotten samples were brought to light. When DNA sequences from the cases were compared, investigators confirmed all belonged to the same perpetrator. What the victims had said, that there was a single person behind the series of crimes, was now scientifically proven. The real turning point came when investigators applied the method of genealogy, using genetic genealogy databases to find distant relatives of the perpetrator. DNA samples were uploaded to the gene match system, and from there emerged faint connections, fourth and fifth-degree relatives. From those complicated family branches, detectives patiently built a family tree, filtering out hundreds, then dozens, until one name stood out: Joseph James D'Angelo, a former police officer who had served in California, living quietly in a small neighborhood, pretending to be an ordinary old neighbor. In April 2018, after many days of secret surveillance, the police took a DNA sample from a tissue he threw in the trash. The results were a perfect match with DNA from dozens of crime scenes. The truth was revealed. The man who had spread fear for more than 4 decades, the man who had made the police helpless, was the man who had lived among them all along. The day he was arrested, D'Angelo sat on his porch, his expressionless eyes staring straight ahead as the police approached. Neighbors were stunned. They only knew him as a grumpy old man who often screamed when children played loudly. No one suspected that behind that ordinary face lay the ghost of the Golden State Killer. News spread quickly, and former victims sobbed when they heard the real name of the man who had ruined their lives. One woman said, "I've waited my whole life for this day. I want to look him in the eye and let him know I'm still alive." The trial lasted for months. The victims, now elderly, entered the courtroom with gray hair and canes, but their voices still trembled as they had before. They recounted the terrible nights, the flashlights, the whispers, the feeling of helplessness. One elderly man choked up as he spoke of his wife, who died years after the attack, but whose wounds had never healed. The courtroom fell silent, save for sobs. D'Angelo eventually pleaded guilty to 13 murders and numerous other assaults to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. When the judge read his sentence, many of the victims burst into tears and hugged each other, feeling for the first time that justice had been served after 40 years of waiting. One woman said he thought he could hide forever, but he lost a DNA swab. That moment of justice was not just for the victim, but for the entire California community. Families who had lived in fear could breathe a sigh of relief. Retired detectives shed tears because their efforts were finally not in vain. And the lesson was remembered. Science can be silent for years, but when the time comes, the truth never disappears. The story of the Golden State Killer does not end here. D'Angelo's arrest was only the culmination, but the investigation lasted for decades, with countless dead ends, mistakes, and extraordinary perseverance from police, scientists, and victims. If you want to understand more about how a ghost could evade justice for more than 40 years, and how DNA technology changed the whole game, continue watching Golden State Killer Investigation. Decades of Fear True Crime Documentary, Part 4. Don't look away, because what follows will show you why this case has been called the longest and most haunting investigation in American criminal history.